This sting is not from me, but from one who is almighty and all-knowing. And he bade me lift up my voice between earth and heaven, and for this there befell me what hath caused the tears of every man of understanding to flow. Baha'u'llah. O kings of the earth, tremble before him who is the sovereign of the world. Bend your heads in humility before him who is the Almighty. Your dominion is but a fleeting shadow, and your authority is but a passing breeze. Turn unto him and forsake your vainglory, that ye may find true and abiding glory. Baha'u'llah. Be fair, O people of the earth, and follow not the footsteps of the unjust. Let justice and mercy be your adornment and your guide. Baha'u'llah. So now I will introduce our speaker for today, and just a reminder to save all your questions until after the talk when we'll have our Q&A session. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I will put in the Zoom chat and the YouTube description box. So our speaker this week is Dr. Stephen Vickers, and his topic is The Prophet Who Wrote to the Kings, A Divine Message for Our Time. Stephen Vickers holds an MA in International Economics and a PhD in International Fisheries Law from the University of Warwick, UK. A qualified company secretary and a former awarding body CEO, he was for 5 years one of 2 UK-based Transnational Education Experts for ENIC UK, and serves as secretary of the UK Bahá'i community's Religious Education Task Force, and as a member of the Bahá'i Regional Council for England. His wife of 50 years standing is the children's writer Rebecca Vickers. Stephen is a life member of Anti-Slavery International and devoted to the Marine Conservation Society. He is a trustee and former chair of the International Tree Foundation, founded in 1922 as Men of the Trees. And with that, I'll hand it off to Stephen.
Thank you very much indeed, Bayan. The question then remains, what, if anything, does this guy know about Baha'u'llah's letter to the kings? And probably no more than most of you, actually. I'm not going to presume to know exactly why Baha'u'llah wrote to the kings, etc. I will be putting forward some ideas, but mostly there's really only time to tell you something about the kings to whom he wrote and what he said to them, roughly speaking. But to me, these messages are both universal and specific. The Universal House of Justice, in One Common Faith, published in 2005, said basically it's impossible to imagine how different the history of the past century and a half would have been had any of the leading arbiters of world affairs addressed by Baha'u'llah spared time for reflection on a conception of reality supported by the moral credentials of its author, moral credentials of the kind they profess to hold in the highest regard. In other words, if they'd listened to him, the earth would have been much different from what it is now. Baha'u'llah, of course, was imprisoned in the Black Pit in 1852, and a former water tank under the Shah's palace. It's a really remarkable story in itself that a prisoner, first of the Qajars and then of the Ottomans, where many of his fellow inmates were hauled off to be executed, survived in order to write to all these kings from Mount Carmel, and some of them from Edirne, Adrianople. While engulfed in tribulations, I heard a most wondrous, a most sweet voice calling above my head. I beheld a maiden pointing with her finger upon my head. By God, this is the best beloved of the worlds, and yet you comprehend not. This is the beauty of God amongst you, and the power of his sovereignty within you. Could you but understand? This is the mystery of God and his treasure. He's then exiled, first to Baghdad, then spends 2 years as a hermit in Kurdistan. Then he's summoned to Istanbul, he's not allowed to meet the Sultan, which he had hoped to do so. And then he went to Edirne, was sent to Edirne, the former pre-Istanbul capital of the Ottoman Empire. At his departure from Baghdad, he declared publicly that he was the manifestation of God for this age. Since he was gaining followers in Istanbul, he went to Edirne. And finally, in 1868, he was sent to the most severe prison in the whole Ottoman Empire, Akka, a walled city inhabited only by condemned criminals, soldiers, and civil servants. He called the citadel there the most great prison. Here's a map of his exiles. So, how did a prisoner in the Ottomans' toughest prison write to the kings and rulers of the world? Not just write to them, but comment upon their motivation, sometimes rebuke them. It's easy to say, as I've heard a Christian writer say, that he was copying Muhammad. But the content shows that he was talking to them both as individuals and as part of a royal collective. Partly, he was freer for much of his time in the prison, you might imagine, because the governors kept going soft on him. As Salah Jara said to me about Abdul Baha, he was a prisoner, but he was the king of Akka. And the same was probably even more true of Baha'u'llah, that many of the Egyptian descent Baha'is that you meet today are descended from the administrators and the soldiers who ran the prison or ran Akka in those days. Now, you may ask, why didn't he write to the rulers of Asia and Africa? And the thing to remember is that by 1885, which within really 15 years of him finishing these letters, only Ethiopia, Japan, Thailand and Korea on these two continents were completely outside the control of those to whom he wrote. Even China had many European enclaves. So his recipients could have changed the world had they listened to him at this point. The prison city, as you can see, they came in by sea. Such a strong city that Napoleon I had been unable to take it. This is the citadel where Baha'u'llah was held. When they arrived at Akka, all the ordinary, legal, decent, common criminals in the prison city gathered together to throw things at the heretics, thinking, well, at least, I may be a murderer, but at least I'm not a heretic. And Bahir Khanum, the daughter of Baha'u'llah, writes rather movingly of this. And I'll leave you to read that later. But she just thought it was terrible. But Baha'u'llah explains that as they entered the city with all these terrible people yelling at them and so on, he heard a voice which said, "Soon will all that dwell on earth be enlisted under these banners." Now let's get to the letters. The nature of the letters. In 1867 to 71, he wrote to a range of world leaders. He wrote to the Sultan and to his two chief ministers from Edirne, and probably indeed, the first letter to Napoleon III, also from Edirne. Most of the letters he wrote from the prison at Akka, and he wrote not only to kings, but also the president of the American republics, all one letter. He wrote some of them to kings and generals and rulers collectively. It's insufficient to ask a question like, what did he say to X? Every letter is a masterpiece and includes theology, advice on how to create world peace, and often an account of the treatment of Baha'is and their children. Remember, by the close of the scramble for Africa, these monarchs were to rule most of the world. What were the letters like? Well, mostly he was kind and polite, even to those who received an element of criticism. And he says to them, it is not my intention, he says to Napoleon III, to utter words of condemnation. Although he was ruder to Napoleon III than most other people. How were they delivered? That to the Shah through Badi, a youth that he had take it. Most of them was delivered through consuls. It is alleged, although I haven't been able to find out if it's true or not, that the French consul became a believer. You may ask, in what languages were they written? Mostly they were written in Arabic. Which were received, I can't tell you. I do know that the letter to Queen Victoria is in the British government archives at Kew, so obviously she received hers. Most of them were written 1868 to 69. That to the German Emperor was clearly 1871, because it refers to the fall of Napoleon III as already having happened. The US, you guys from Virginia are going to ask me, 1868, did it go to Grant or Johnson? Probably Grant, because it probably arrived after March 1869. But again, I'm not absolutely sure. I wouldn't suppose that most of those of you in North America, obviously Pauline is a different matter, would recognize the map of Europe at this time, but you can see many different things about it. Ottoman Empire comes quite a long way into Europe. There's Austro-Hungary, which of course doesn't exist anymore. Germany is not yet united. There's Prussia. The Republic of Ireland is part of Great Britain. And the Ottoman Empire rules to a greater or lesser extent bits of North Africa. Italy is not completely united, but pretty well united compared to what it had been 20 years ago before that. The first guy I'm going to deal with is Pius IX. In Italian, Pio Nono, the guy who always says no, Supreme Pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church and King of Rome. The United Kingdom of Italy only united in 1867. You can see all of it becomes part of Italy with the French, Napoleon III driving the Austrians out of Lombardy and Venetia. But Rome is still in the hands of the Pope, much smaller than the Papal States had been in 1848. But that's for another time. Now, before 1848, Pius was a modernizer and advocated constitutional monarchy. Indeed, the Italian nationalists wanted him to be the leader. But in the year of revolutions, Mazzini, Garibaldi, the Italian nationalists, took control of Rome and the Papal States in the name of a united Italy. Then the French Emperor Napoleon III sent troops to restore the Pope to his throne, and then he became an arch-conservative. In 1860, the King of Sardinia defeated the Papal army, and that only left the King of the city of Rome itself in Papal hands, whereas previously he had quite a big country. After 1870, after Baha'u'llah's letter, the Prussian invasion of France caused Napoleon III to withdraw his troops that were protecting the Pope from Rome, and the Italians walked into Rome and incorporated as their capital. Pius became the prisoner of the Vatican. Council of Cardinals declared him infallible on doctrine. He wrote to the King of Sardinia, the King of Italy, opposing free universal education in a country that was 75% illiterate. In 2000, he was beatified, so he's probably well on his way to becoming a saint. Main points of the message from Baha'u'llah. The Lord of Lords has come overshadowed with clouds. He hath come down from heaven, even as he came down from it the first time. He says Jesus lived in poverty. You, the Pope, don't need all these palaces. Abandon thy kingdom unto the kings, which of course happens the very next year. But the Pope was not to know that. Baha'u'llah certainly knew that, of course. He talks of how the Pharisees disputed with Jesus and warns the Pope not to do the same with Baha'u'llah. And he speaks through the Pope to Christianity in general, not just Catholics, but to Protestants, to Christians, monks, etc. You can only really appreciate these letters if you study them himself. He compares himself to Christ. Big thing here. Christ said, "Come ye after men, and I will make you to become fishers of men." In this day, however, we say, "Come ye after me, that we may make you to become quickeners of mankind." Now, I want to stop some wise guy who's going to ask me a question right at the end of this lecture and say, "Why do you say the Pope lost his kingdom? Because there's still a Vatican City." Well, good point. But the point was that in 1871, the Kingdom of Rome ceased to exist. The Pope was now only a religious leader. The current Vatican City dates to the Lateran Treaty of 1929 with Mussolini. So he really did abandon his kingdom under the kings. Next guy I want to deal with is Louis Napoleon, Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III. Why did he become Napoleon III? Because Napoleon's son would have been Napoleon II, although he never came to the throne. So he took the third after his uncle and his cousin. He was son of Napoleon's brother, King Louis I of Holland. He was imprisoned for rebellion. Then he worked as a docker in New York City. He was a very good winner, and he used to wager people and won a lot of money in racing because people didn't imagine anyone so short would be such a good runner. He worked as a police constable, an ordinary policeman in London in 1848. But in 1848, with the 1848 revolutions, which happened all over Europe, he moved to Paris and he won election from name recognition alone as president of the new Second Republic. He carried out a coup in 1851 where he sent troops to arrest 150 different members of parliament all at the same time, and made himself emperor. This is his wife, the Empress Eugenie, part Irish, part Spanish. So Donna Maria Eugenia Ignacia Augustina de Palafox y Kirkpatrick. What you have to understand is these guys were the Victorian world's first power couple. After Perkin discovered coal tar dyes, and it was possible to make purple dyes, Eugenie was the first woman to wear a purple dress, and within a year, half the society women all over Europe were wearing purple dresses. They had beautiful palaces. They were considered to be hot stuff. They'd be in all the fashion magazines these days. But Napoleon III himself was a bit of a supreme meddler, and actually Baha'u'llah hints at this in his letter. Mark Twain writes beautifully describing seeing Napoleon III. Short, long-bodied, short-legged man, fiercely moustached, old, wrinkled, with eyes half closed, and such a deep, crafty, scheming expression about them. He rebuilt Paris with very broad boulevards, not because necessarily he wanted Paris to look a good place, but because there had been three previous revolutions in 1789, 1830, 1848, where the revolutionaries had built barricades across the roads. He built these wide roads that were hard to barricade. He rearmed France, made it the most powerful country in Europe. He drove the Italian nationalists out of Lombardy in 1859, so helped the Italian nationalists drive the Austrians out of Lombardy and Venetia, but then he took Rome back from them and took Savoy and Nice from them. He went to war with Russia with British helps to back up the Turks. And if you look at when Baha'u'llah talks about God knows what you really meant, what you really thought, you need to look at this history and you can understand what Baha'u'llah is saying to him. He's basically saying, God knows your inmost thoughts. You said you did this because of this reason, but actually God knows why you did it. He invaded Mexico and put an Austrian Prince Maximilian von Habsburg on the throne, but then didn't stand up for him, and he was shot by Austrian revolutionaries. He bullied the Coptic, the Orthodox Muslim authorities in Jerusalem to allow Catholic monks shared custodianship of the Christian holy places. Why am I telling you this? Because in the same way as the Pope could never have expected to have lost his kingdom the year after Baha'u'llah said to him, "Abandon thy kingdom unto the kings," Napoleon III was universally viewed as the most powerful monarch in Europe. Baha'u'llah sent two messages to him. The first, he cast behind him contemptuously. Napoleon III is reminded by Baha'u'llah that Christ had been missed by many at the time, and you shouldn't make the same mistake with him. God knew that Napoleon III's statements for joining the Crimean War were untrue. And he says, "We tested thee and found thee wanting," which is a quote from the Old Testament, the writing on the wall, the King Nebuchadnezzar, the older ones of you will remember. And he says this verse, "For what thou hast done, thy kingdom shall be thrown into confusion, and thine empire shall pass from thine hands, as a punishment for that which thou hast wrought." Now, if you want to look at Jan Yashin's work, Polish-Canadian work on historical mentions of the faith in North America, there's something on this whole area. And I understand, I've heard it alleged that Napoleon III, seeing the letter, said, "If this man is of God, I am two gods." But I've no idea if it's true or not. He says, "Look after the poor." But he tells Napoleon III, "We have ordained that our cause be taught through the power of utterance." In other words, you guys are all wonderful speakers, and that's the way you're going to teach people, not by force. And this rapid demotion happens. 1869, he's considered the top dog in Europe. He declared war on Germany for various reasons in 1870. If you see the articles in the Times, which you Americans call the London Times, at that time, British commentators were just convinced that France would win easily. No such luck. The other German states backed Prussia because it was being attacked. And because they had railways, they mobilized much more quickly than the French and outmaneuvered them. He was surrounded and captured at Sedan in northeastern France, spat out by his own soldiers, and he then moved to Britain. And he's now, President Macron is discussing bringing him and his family back to France, but they're buried in Britain, in Hampshire. Their only son of Eugenie and Napoleon III was killed in 1879 while serving the British Army in the Zulu War. Queen Victoria, the Queen of Britain and Canada for that matter, was heartbroken because she didn't like republics, and she was hoping one day that the Prince Imperial would go back and be French Emperor. Now let's look at Alexander II, another person to whom Baha'u'llah wrote, Tsar of all the Russias. The House of Romanov was the dynasty, the Russian Empire, from 1613 to 1917. Alexander's ambassador interceded with the Shah to save Baha'u'llah from execution. Why? One, because Baha'u'llah's brother worked for the Russian legation. Two, because the province of Nur, of which Baha'u'llah's father was the duke, if you wish, was up against the Russian Empire, and the Tsar didn't want any troubles on his borders. Now, here's the kind of strange paradox. Alexander II freed the serfs in 1861. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves in any counties that were in rebellion against the United States in 1863. The others had to wait a bit longer. He introduced courts, local government, abolished corporal punishment. Basically, we would see him now as a good bloke, a positive man. Assassinated in 1881, one of the people who assassinated him was the brother of Lenin, the future Soviet leader. And his grandson, Nicholas II, and his whole nuclear family was murdered by the communist captors in 1918. Baha'u'llah is very nice to Alexander II. So I'm not going to give any quotation, but you can read the letter. You can see that he congratulates him on a number of good things. Victoria von Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Queen of Great Britain, Empress of India. Now, the message to Queen Victoria, like the one for Napoleon III, is quite interesting. He shows how he himself fulfills biblical prophecies, and he quotes, as he does for Napoleon III, he quotes prophecies in the Bible, which he says refer to him. He also says, "Thou hast forbidden the trading in slaves, both men and women. This verily is what God hath enjoined in this wondrous revelation." So he congratulates her for that, even though the original legislation predated Queen Victoria, but the actual mass freeing was about when she became queen. He also congratulates her for setting up a constitutional monarchy, and he addresses elected representatives of people in every land. Take your counsel together, and let your concern be only for that which profiteth mankind. And then he makes this statement, which is well known to Baha'is and will be known to a lot of you who aren't Baha'is. That which the Lord hath ordained as a sovereign remedy and mightiest instrument for the healing of all the world is the union of all its peoples in one universal cause, one common faith. And then he speaks through the kings, through Queen Victoria to the kings. He tells them to be united. He tells them to not increase their expenditure, not spend too much on weaponry. You can check these yourself. Nasruddin Shah, obviously a very brave man by the number of medals he's been awarded. Tablet to the Shah. Obviously, Baha'u'llah knew the Shah from when they were both children together. To me, the Tablet to the Shah is a literary masterpiece. I'm just going to read a tiny bit from that. Whither are gone the learned men, the divines and potentates of old? What hath become of their discriminating views, their shrewd perceptions, their subtle insights and sage pronouncements? Where are their hidden coffers, their flaunted ornaments, their gilded couches, their rugs and cushions strewn about? Paints this beautiful picture of these erudite, languishing people. And then he says, well, all in their graves, and their palaces are wrecked and all that. Now he's talking to a man he knows. With thy love in my heart, nothing can ever alarm me. And he says to the Shah, those around you love you for your own sake. I love you for your sake. This is quite a nice thing to say to a guy whose predecessors had you exiled and imprisoned. He talks about the sufferings and executions of his friends. He proves his cause from Christianity and Islam. And he appeals to the Shah to protect the Baha'is in Persia from oppression. It still hasn't worked that well. Abdulaziz, also the Caliph of Sunni Islam, you'll notice, not at the time, both a religious and a temporal king, didn't stop him having several hundred concubines, of course. Only had 4 wives, of course, but 800 concubines. The letters to the 2 chief ministers actually are very, very blunt. Baha'u'llah is rude to them. He talks about them not doing anything to ameliorate the plague, talks about their corruption, their disdain for the people. Now, he calls the Sultan King of Islam, which is what the Sultan called himself. So he talks to Islam through the king. Have I, O king, ever disobeyed thee? And then says, a good advice to all monarchs. Beware, O king, that thou gather not around thyself such ministers as follow the desires of a corrupt inclination. Know thou for certainty that whoso disbelieveth in God is neither trustworthy nor truthful. And he also says, no faith or religion hath ever held children responsible, talking about why should children be maltreated by the Sultan's chief ministers. And he also says, the Sultan, place not thy reliance on their treasures. Now, I'm running out of time for this, but if you ever get the chance, read Mark Twain's Roughing It. No, The Innocents Abroad. And you will see, he sees, I've also showed you what he says about Napoleon III, what he says about Abdulaziz is a bit insulting. He found his great empire a blot upon the earth, a degraded, poverty-stricken, miserable, infamous agglomeration of ignorance, crime, and brutality, will idle away the allotted days of his trivial life and then pass to the dust and the worms and leave it so. That's Mark Twain. Baha'u'llah is much nicer to him. This is where he kept his concubines. Fuad Pasha, again, he talks about how his family has been oppressed by Ali Pasha, and he talks about what's going to happen to the land around Edirne, which he calls the land of mystery. Here's how it all looks at the end of 1871. You see Rome has vanished into Italy. Germany has become one country and so on. Now, I'm just going to deal with one prophecy and then I'm going to whip through stuff. The day is approaching when the land of mystery and what is beside it shall be changed and shall pass out of the hand of the king. And Edirne was then well within the Ottoman Empire. But 5 different wars affected it in the next Edirne. It was occupied by the Russians in 1877. It only became Turkish again in 1920. And still, petty nationalism ends lives in the Balkans. What happens to the Sultan's family? If you have too many concubines, too many wives, you end up with too many people, and all these different nephews keep having a go at being Sultan until eventually the Young Turk Rebellion, the same people who rescued Abdul Baha and the Baha'is from a prison in 1908, removed first the Caliphate and then the Empire. Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, been going since 1020. Massive monarchy in the Middle Ages. Baha'u'llah only wrote a short letter to him, regretting that when he came to the Holy Land, he took no notice of Baha'u'llah. His family died out because they all ended up being killed in different ways. As I said, Napoleon III put the brother of Franz Joseph onto the throne of Mexico. And then when President Andrew Johnson of America threatened him, he refused to back up Maximilian, and Maximilian was then captured and shot by the Mexicans. Franz Joseph II, Rudolph, committed suicide. His nephew was shot by Serbian nationalist Princip, which started the First War, etc. Now, almost the last, the von Hohenzollerns are the ruling house of Prussia. Wilhelm I, famous for his fine moustaches. They prospered through science and militarism. No offense, Bayan, of course. Territorial expansion was a royal obsession of this family of Hohenzollerns, and they kept adding bits of territory, sometimes in a cheeky way. Frederick the Great of Prussia stole Silesia off the Austrians by a surprise invasion and then offered to pay for it. It's just like people do now with Greenland, of course, if we're not careful. Prussia gained more land after Waterloo, took land from Denmark in the 1860s, and in 1871 took over the other German states after a successful war against France. Here's a picture of Otto von Bismarck with his chancellor with the emperor. What does he say? He knows that pride is this man's problem. Take heed lest pride debar thee from recognizing the dayspring of divine revelation, i.e. Baha'u'llah. Do thou remember the one whose power transcended thy power and whose station excelled thy station? Where is he? He it was who cast the tablet of God behind him, wherefore disgrace assailed him from all sides. He's writing to the Emperor of Germany about the Emperor of France, and the Emperor of Germany is just defeated. I told you, everybody thought Napoleon III was top dog. The Germans defeated them. Emperor Frederick William became very proud. but it's not going to last. Baha'u'llah makes two prophecies, twofold prophecy. O banks of the Rhine, we have seen you covered with gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you. And you shall have another turn. And we hear the lamentations of Berlin, though she be today in conspicuous glory. At the end of the Second War, Berlin becomes a city divided, and in 1962, that city division becomes a wall, one of only two capital cities to be divided in the same way. Nicosia on Cyprus still is that way. But, you know, it's funny because the Persian, some Shiite leaders who didn't like Baha'is in 1917, when they thought the Germans were winning, said, oh, Baha'u'llah said the Germans are going to lose this war. And all of a sudden, so they publicized this prophecy, and then all of a sudden things turned bad for the Germans and they lost the First War. So this again, they publicized Baha'u'llah's prophecies, deposed. The family still exists. Karl von Habsburg, formerly the Archduke of Austria, is a member of parliament in Austria and used to be a German member of the European Parliament. And there we are. The Kaiser himself, the son of him to whom Baha'u'llah wrote, lived until 1940. Okay, this is a brief introduction to a massive subject. Most of the letters appear in the summons of the Lord of Hosts. I apologize that I tend to have spoken rather more about the nature of the kings, and I haven't mentioned Lincoln and the President of the American Republics. But I find that many people are not as aware of the history. So when they read Baha'u'llah's letters and they see these prophecies, they don't realize the extent to which they came true, which is in itself a remarkable thing. Ladies and gentlemen, my case rests.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vickers. That was really amazing. And it's funny because I was just reading Summons of the Lord of Hosts the last few days, coincidentally. And I think this was a great addition. And I know I will be rewatching it to, really study in depth Baha'u'llah's letters to the kings. So now we have time for questions. And if you have questions, you can write them in the chat and I will read them out. One question asks, how should we understand the fact that most rulers rejected his message, yet the world has moved in the direction of the principles he articulated?
Baha'u'llah said to a number of people, and particularly in one of the letters, I forget to whom at the moment, he said, even if you reject this message, the very stones will bring it about, or words to that effect. He also says somewhere else, this cause shall raise its head in the midmost ocean if they try to wipe it out. And Baha'u'llah says, he saith, that's God, be, and it is. He says that when a new messenger comes, all things are made new. So the point is that had the then kings and rulers taken this opportunity to, as he put it, take you counsel together and resolve your difficulties and remove your differences, it would have been much less painful. What we've seen since is, you're right, the earth to some extent moving in the correct direction. And we have seen problems. And then at the end of the First World War, largely through the actions of Woodrow Wilson, you get the League of Nations. You'll notice that in the tablet to The Hague, Abdu'l-Baha actually identifies that the League of Nations is a good thing, but it won't work for various reasons, one of which that it's united governments and not united people. And he says that General Assemblies should be proportionate to the number of people and should be elected by legislatures. This obviously would mean that China would have a quarter of the people, but there we are. But this point has been made also by Baha'is. It was made in 1948. It was made again in the Charter Review Conference in 1954. It was made again in the Millennium UN Conference in 2000. So we are always happy to see the world move in the right direction because it's inevitable. But it's how bumpy the road is. So you get the Second War because gradually most big countries, apart from France and Britain, as they were then, and less big countries than they are now, than they were then, abandoned listening to the League. And at the end of the Second War, we introduced the United Nations, which is a step forward. We're now coming to the point where the time's plague, as Shakespeare might have put it, is the big man. The guy, I'm not just talking about President Trump, I'm talking about this is a standard problem. There were 26 presidents in the world at the moment who have exceeded their time limits and should not be president by their own constitution. 26, mostly African and Latin America, but not all of them. But we're moving towards a position, the big man, where people think the UN doesn't refer to them. And my suspicion is that the same things that happened in the 30s are going to happen now. And life will get so bad that then we'll have to improve the UN and move on from it.
Thank you. Another question is asking about the response of Queen Victoria to the message of Baha'u'llah and the reply Baha'u'llah gives to this response to the Queen.
Yes, it is said that she said, if this is of God, it can do. If this is of God, it will endure. If not, it can do no harm. And it's true that of all the monarchies to which she wrote, the only one that is still in place is the British monarchy, but it's looking increasingly shaky, not so much from things that the king or indeed his mother did, but more the things that the king's brother would appear to have done of late. So we have this strange situation where Baha'u'llah says, from two ranks amongst men, power has been seized, kings and ecclesiastics. So we suspect that although he's quite nice about monarchies, and he actually says at present, he said that form of government operated by the British seems good, since that nation is endowed both with the light of kingdom and of consultation. But that was in the 1890s, also the 1880s. And we know full well that he says, from two ranks amongst men, power has been seized, kings and ecclesiastic. So presumably, even the Queen of Denmark is one day going to be replaced, or else they're going to become very, very different kinds of people. As I said, there's still an Emperor of Austria, but he's now the Archduke and he doesn't have any power. So it may be that that's the kind of solution we will have. There's still a Shah of Persia, but he doesn't have any power. Maybe it'll be that way. But we also know that somewhere it says in the writings that one of the signs that we're getting close to it is the dying out of the institution of kingship. Now, there's still many, many monarchies all over the place. If you look at Nigeria probably has about 25 monarchies. Uganda still has a monarchy. Many, many Asian countries have monarchies. All the Scandinavian countries have monarchies. So the truth is we don't know actually what it means. But in all probability, having been nice about Baha'u'llah's letter doesn't in fact imply that ultimately the future will not sweep you away. One of the things I will say is that when I started looking at these letters, I took the view that probably many of these things would not have reached the monarch in question. But now I know that Victoria certainly did, and I know that Napoleon III certainly did. And we also know from the work of, is it Dr. Vadat? I forget, I probably get his name wrong, in Denmark, that the Russian archives and indeed the Turkish archives have a lot of stuff mentioning Baha'u'llah in their Foreign Office archives. And particularly the Turkish archives tell us that the Persian governments were obsessed with tell us what Baha'u'llah is saying about us, which is quite amazing that here's this guy sent to be a prisoner, to be forgotten. What in the medieval times you would have called a prison like that, an oubliette, a place to be forgotten. And yet the Persian government is obsessed that he might not be saying lovely things about the Persian government. Of course, he wasn't that kind of person, so he was not always insulting the Persians. But it's obvious they were always writing to the Ottomans to check whether he was being less than complimentary about the Persian government. But of course, he wasn't. So I think we now realize that the amount of correspondence in general was much less. If you take the assassination of the Bab, the martyrdom of the Bab, execution of the Bab, which, for those who don't know, is you could compare them with a bit with John the Baptist, but actually is more important than that. Or probably John the Baptist is probably more important than we pretend anyway. We have in our British archives at Kew, we have the letter from Lord Shield to the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, in his own handwriting. And we have Lord Palmerston's letter back in his own handwriting. There was so little, much less correspondence than there is today. And there was not a massive bureaucracy of many thousands of people working in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office like there are today. So I think the chance of it being seen, at least by a monarch secretary, is quite strong.
It's very interesting. The next question asks, if these letters were sent to the current world leaders, do you think they would be receptive to them or reject them like they did in the past?
I wouldn't wish to cast aspersions to any leader, but I would not be surprised if there are not lots and lots of bewildered people in some ways, people with mental problems writing to world leaders to give them their advice. And therefore, I think that if Baha'u'llah were to write now to world leaders, it wouldn't even get through to the presidency or to the prime minister, whatever. But one of the interesting points, though, is of course that if the consul, Baha'u'llah's letters, some of them went to the country's consul in Beirut, some of them to Jerusalem. Some countries had a consul in Haifa. Nobody had a consul in Akka itself. And depending on what country it was, Baha'u'llah sent someone with a letter to the local consulate. If the local consul thought it was relevant, they would have passed it on. So I suppose that's the real question, that if a local consul thought it was a really important letter, then it would be sent, and at least somebody of some status would see it. But I think now, in universal literacy, and also a situation where the amount of people who think that their hot stuff is so great, I suspect it would be much, much harder to get these letters to where they were intended to go.
The next question is, what distinguishes Baha'u'llah's approach to political power from earlier prophets who interacted with rulers indirectly or symbolically?
That's actually a very interesting question. The Buddha, like Baha'u'llah, was himself quite an important noble, and therefore had no worries. In the case of Moses also, of course, was an adopted member of Pharaoh's family. The point is, whatever, that a manifestation of God is going to be, as the Guardian puts it, all confidence. And the manifestation of God has the ability to speak, whether orally or in writing, to people of all levels. Look, I've known people who were illiterate, and once we taught them just to read the long prayers translated from the Guardian, which we thought they would never master these polysyllabic Latinisms, they did. And it's because the word of God is, in my humble opinion, speaks to human beings, because human beings have a God-receptive element to them. So in probability, the only thing that is a distinction here is that Baha'u'llah is making a claim to be the universal manifestation, in a way, that this is the opportunity for, as de Chardin put it, the hominization of man. This is the coming of the kingdom of God, or in that day there will be one Lord and his name one, as it says in the Old Testament. And therefore, when Muhammad wrote to the king of Ethiopia, or when he wrote to the Byzantine emperor, he told the Byzantine emperor that one day his city, Constantinople, would be a great Muslim city. Of course, it took 750 years before it became such, or 700 years. But Baha'u'llah is saying, all of you get together, think about mankind as a whole. And I think it's this. It's not just saying, I'm the promised one, come and bow down before me. It's listen to me, because I know what God wants you to do. And part of this is to take counsel together and sort out the problems of the world. And that is different.
Thank you. How do these letters challenge the assumption that religion belongs to the private sphere rather than the ordering of society?
It's funny. That's a kind of modern concept, isn't it? The idea that you shouldn't have prayer in schools is something which was established in the United States, certainly, by case law from the Supreme Court, not really in the Constitution, I don't think. Am I right? It's certainly that the idea that religion is a matter of the private sphere certainly is not held by ayatollahs or grand ayatollahs. It certainly was not held in the Treaty of Augsburg in 1555 in Europe, which decided curius regio eius religio. In other words, whatever the king is, the religion of the people has to be. And that was a more normal view. My own grandparents, I grew up an Anglican Christian. My own grandparents felt very strongly that if you were English, if you were really English, you should be Church of England. And I'm sure that before the Iranian Revolution, probably most Iranians would have thought if you're Persian, you need to be a Shiite. Probably rather less feel that now, because the government has not distinguished itself for its morality and honesty. But over most countries, look at the current political problems in Thailand, where again the country is divided between those who think the king should be able to control religion as well or not. Or look at the Spanish Civil War, where a lot of people backed Franco, not because they wanted fascism, but because they wanted to go back to the old Spain of king and Catholicism. And indeed, one way that Franco got them on board was by promising to restore the monarchy afterwards, which is what he did, and to restore the church afterwards, which is what he did. So I think that's a modern view. And I think when Baha'u'llah wrote it, it was not commonly felt. Now, there were one or two examples of exception to this. The Netherlands, after getting its independence from Spain in the partly in the 1500s and then in the 1600s, 1648, it's really, really definite. 1609, it's mostly definite. introduced toleration. The English Commonwealth, as it was called, when we executed our king and chucked him out for 11 years, 1649 to 1660, they introduced religious toleration. But when the monarchy came back, they introduced Anglicanism and enforced it again, which is why so many Puritans and such went to New England. And it wasn't until 1689 that freedom of religion became normal. And even then, it was not absolute for Catholics until 1806. So in most states, the idea that you had the right to believe what you wanted to believe was not well established. North America was an exception in this.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes, there's a question that asks, can you comment on the fact that kingship involves someone taking responsibility for the welfare of a nation, and the fact that partisanship in most countries today can lead to an irresponsible attitude on the part of many partisan politicians toward the long-term welfare?
Yes, I must admit something here, which is not really necessarily a Bahá'í position. In recent discussions with my son, who lives in Greater Chicago, I had always said to him, to me, an absolute monarchy is a bad idea, but actually a constitutional monarchy is a good idea. If nothing else, it stops having a political presidency. And recent events in a number of countries have given me to realize that even what we thought were the most constitutional and honorable of countries are capable of having leadership which suddenly ignores the laws and ignores the rules and so on. And that, in a sense, as I said to him last week, proves that to an extent, to have a figurehead monarchy, what we would call, and I think Pauline would understand this, a Scandinavian style monarchy, which we almost have in Britain, but not quite, where the monarch is basically an adjudicator only in extreme cases, is a good one. Extreme cases, Queen Elizabeth II intervened in Australian politics once when there was a complete impasse between the Senate, Australian Senate, and the Australian Parliament. But normally speaking, our monarch, for instance, doesn't try to interfere with the decisions of Parliament. When Brexit was signed, Britain leaving the EU, the then Queen, the mother of the existing king, thought it was a very bad idea. And she wore a big blue hat, the colour of the EU flag, with gold stars all around it, like the EU flag, at the ceremony for Brexit, kind of saying, actually, I don't want this. And my own daughter, who used to be the British lawyer at the European Union, when the Brexit Treaty was signed, she had big earrings that were made in the EU design. But of course, the men never noticed, but the women noticed these things. So, yes, in many countries, the monarch can be protective. And places like Bhutan and so on, you can see work very, very well. In Tibet, particularly where in the case of the Dalai Lama or in the King of Bhutan, they have a religious role as well. But within countries which are increasingly politicized, there's a big danger if the monarchy takes one side or the other, as the Spanish did in the Spanish Civil War. So, yes, it's a good theory, but as the earth changes, it may not always be possible. And obviously, people do have rights. So I actually still favor constitutional monarchy as an individual, but I'm not saying that as a Baha'i. I have no idea. Whatever the House of Justice says is fine by me.
Thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Vickers. It looks like that's all of our questions. I think this was an amazing topic to talk about, especially in modern times when, political institutions are, their authority and legitimacy is being questioned. I think it's always good to return to the divine message to these same institutions and see what we can glean. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for being joined.
So our speaker next week is going to be Mr. Alan Smith, and his topic is going to be AI through the eyes of a Baha'i. And that'll be a two-part talk, so it'll be next Saturday and the following. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so you can invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I will put in the Zoom chat and the YouTube description box. Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you all next Saturday. Have a great week.